The plumber called me at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in the kitchen drinking my second cup of coffee, watching the Cardinals fight over the feeder in the backyard, the same thing I did every morning since my wife passed. Hal Brennan, the guy I'd hired to fix a burst pipe under the utility sink in my wife's old workshop. I'd been putting off that repair for nearly 3 years, same as I'd been putting off everything else that had to do with that room. I almost didn't answer. Then I saw the text he sent right after the missed call. "Please pick up. I need you to come down here. Don't call anyone else first." I called him back immediately. Mr. Calloway. His voice was strange, low and tight, the voice of a man trying to stay calm and not quite managing it. "I need you to come to the workshop. Right now." "Hal, what's wrong? Did the pipe burst worse than we thought?" "No, sir. The pipe is fine. I fixed it." A pause. "It's something else. Something behind the wall. I didn't mean to find it. I was just checking the studs for moisture damage and the panel just..." It swung open. Another pause. "Sir, there's a box in there. Shh. And a note on top of it with your name on it. In your wife's handwriting." I stood up so fast I knocked my coffee mug off the counter. It shattered on the tile and I didn't look at it once. I walked out of the kitchen and down the basement stairs, and I didn't stop moving until I was standing in the doorway of the room where my wife had spent her happiest hours, the little workshop she had converted from a storage space 12 years ago, where she had thrown pottery and listened to Patsy Cline and come home dusty and smiling. Hal was standing near the far wall, away from the utility sink, his arms at his sides, looking like a man who had wandered into something he deeply wished he hadn't. He pointed. Behind the shelving unit that held her old molds and glazing tools, a section of drywall had swung inward on a hidden hinge. The opening was about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Inside was a fireproof lockbox, gray and heavy-looking, sitting on a small wooden shelf that had been mounted to the studs. Next to the box sat a manila envelope. On the front of the envelope, in the looping, familiar cursive I had been in love with for 31 years, were 2 words. For Raymond. My name. My wife calling me by my name. From the other side of 3 years of silence. "I didn't touch it," Hal said. "I saw the name and I stopped. Thank you." My voice didn't sound like mine. "Can you give me a few minutes?" "Of course." He gathered his tools without another word and walked upstairs. I heard the back door open and close. I stood alone in my wife's workshop for a long moment. The smell of old clay was still there, faint but real, mixed with the damp smell of the leaky pipe. I looked at the shelves, her glazing brushes still arranged by size the way she always kept them, her apron hanging on its hook by the door. I had not moved a single thing in this room since she died. My wife had drowned 3 years ago in the lake behind our friend's property in Vermont. She had gone up there alone for a long weekend, something she did once or twice a year to decompress, to throw pots and read and walk and breathe. The caretaker found her floating near the dock on a Sunday morning. The medical examiner ruled it an accidental drowning. She had gone for an early swim, apparently slipped on the dock, hit her head. It was a tragedy. A terrible, senseless accident. That was what I had told myself for 3 years. I picked up the envelope. Inside was a letter, 7 pages, both sides, written on the yellow legal pad paper she had always preferred. Her handwriting was precise and unhurried. She must have written it somewhere quiet, I thought. She must have been very calm. "My darling Raymond, if you're reading this, then something happened to me that wasn't an accident. I need you to know that before you read another word. And I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I'm sorry I tried to carry this alone. I thought I was protecting you. I think I was wrong. Let me tell you what I found out about our friend. I read for a long time. Her name was Patricia. We had known her for 22 years. She and my wife had been close friends since before our kids were born. The kind of friendship that had its own language and its own history. They had been each other's maid of honor. They had sat together in the waiting room when my wife was in labor with our daughter. When Patricia's first marriage fell apart, my wife had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night to sit with her on her kitchen floor. My wife's letter told me that Patricia was not who we thought she was. In the spring, 3 years ago, my wife had been helping Patricia reorganize the financial records for Patricia's interior design business, a favor between friends, the kind of thing they did for each other. And my wife, who had spent 20 years as a certified public accountant before she retired, had noticed something wrong. Not immediately. Subtly, a pattern of deposits that didn't line up with any client invoices. Payments routed through an LLC she had never heard of. Disbursements to accounts with no paper trail. She had started asking questions, quietly, the way she did everything. She had pulled on the loose thread. What she found underneath was not a loose thread. It was a rope attached to something massive and dark and very, very dangerous. Patricia's design firm was being used to launder money, not for a small operation, for a network that stretched across 4 states, trafficking people, mostly young women, brought in from Central America, and kept in conditions my wife described in her letter in the careful, measured language of a woman trying to stay factual about something that was making her physically sick. She had photographs. She had financial records. She had names. She had confronted Patricia. "I know that was foolish," she wrote. "I know now that it was the worst thing I could have done. But she was my friend. I thought maybe there was an explanation. I thought maybe she was being coerced somehow, that maybe she was a victim too. I was wrong about that. Patricia had not been coerced. Patricia had been a partner since the beginning, 18 years earlier. She had built the infrastructure herself. After my wife confronted her, Patricia went quiet for 2 weeks. No calls, no texts. My wife had assumed Patricia was ashamed, that she was figuring out how to come clean, how to get out. Then a man my wife didn't recognize had followed her home from the grocery store and sat outside our house for 2 hours. She had not called the police. She had not called the FBI. She had come home, gone down to her workshop, and started building. "I didn't come to you because I was afraid," she wrote. "Not for myself, for you, for the kids. These people are not careful criminals, Raymond. They are violent and they are connected, and I have seen what they do to people who threaten them. I decided the only way to protect you was to keep you far away from what I knew. So I built a room. I kept gathering evidence. I made copies of everything, 3 sets, stored in 3 different places. The lockbox in the workshop has 1 set. The combination is my mother's birthday, April 7th, 1941. Arling Sienyen Sia Cheer. The second set is in a safe deposit box at Hargrove Savings on Elm Street. The key is taped to the bottom of the sugar canister in the kitchen. Box number 114. The third set is with a woman named Agent Louise Taft at the FBI field office in Albany. I mailed it to her 6 months ago with a letter explaining everything. If you are reading this, she already has it. She already knows. Go to her, Raymond. Not the local police. Not anyone you think you know. Patricia has friends in many places. Go directly to Agent Taft in Albany. And then, my love, I need you to live. I need you to take care of our children and our grandchildren and to keep going. I know this will break you open. I know because I have spent months imagining your face when you read this letter. But you are stronger than you know. You always have been. I love you more than I have ever known how to say. Your wife, Carol. I don't know how long I stood in that workshop. My legs eventually stopped holding me, and I sat down on the floor with my back against the cold wall, and I held my wife's letter against my chest, and I let everything that had been numb for 3 years come apart at once. She had known. She had known for months that she might die, and she had spent those months not crying, not hiding, not running. She had spent them building a case, protecting a family she was terrified of losing, and I had never suspected a single thing. I had believed it was an accident. I had believed it because I had needed to believe it, because the alternative was too enormous to hold. My wife had been murdered by our friend. Hal Brennan knocked on the back door an hour later and asked if I needed anything. I told him I had found some old documents of my wife's financial records, nothing he needed to worry about. He looked at me the way Hal Brennan had always looked at me, steady and kind, and said he was sorry for my loss, still, even after all this time. I paid him for the pipe and gave him $100 tip and told him his truck was blocking the driveway. I waited until his truck was gone. Then I went to the kitchen, and I stood on a chair, and I lifted the sugar canister off the shelf, and I tilted it upside down. The key was there. Small and silver, taped with a strip of masking tape, a number written on it in blue ink, 114. I sat back down at the kitchen table where I had eaten breakfast with my wife for 31 years, and I thought about what she had asked me to do. Then I picked up my phone and called the FBI field office in Albany. It took 4 days to get through to Agent Louise Taft. When I finally did, when I explained who I was and why I was calling, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Mr. Calloway," she said finally, "I received your wife's package. 3 years ago. I've been waiting. Waiting for what? For a reason to move forward. What she sent me was substantial, but it wasn't enough on its own. I needed the chain of custody to be clear. I needed the original documents." A pause. "You said there's a second set in the workshop and a third in a safe deposit box?" "Yes. I'm going to need both, and I'm going to need you to bring them to me yourself, in person. Don't ship them. Don't leave them with anyone. Can you come to Albany tomorrow?" I told her I would be there before noon. "I want to tell you about my wife. We met in 1988 at a tax preparation office in Portland, Maine, where we were both working our second jobs to save money. I was 31, recently divorced, running a small landscaping company that barely broke even. She was 28, finishing her CPA certification, working 2 jobs because that was simply what she did. She was the most quietly determined person I had ever met. On our first date, she told me she intended to own her own home before she was 35 and to retire before she was 60. She did both. Carol was not a flashy person. She was not loud or dramatic or the kind of woman who filled a room with her presence the way some people do. She filled a room with something quieter than that. A steadiness, a warmth that you felt before you could explain it. People trusted her almost immediately. Dogs went to her. Children went to her. She had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. She loved her pottery, her garden, her grandchildren, strong coffee, detective novels, and old country music. She had been sober for 26 years and spoke about it without shame, the way she spoke about everything, plainly and without drama. She was, in every way that mattered, the best person I have ever known. That she had spent the last months of her life gathering evidence against a human trafficking network while trying to shield her family from danger was exactly the kind of thing she would do. She would have seen it as necessary, and she would have done it without complaint. That she had died, for it was not something I could think about directly for a very long time. Agent Taft was a compact, serious woman in her late 40s who shook my hand and poured me coffee and asked if I needed a moment before we started. I told her I had been taking moments for 3 years and I needed to do something useful now. She nodded and opened a notebook. We worked for 6 hours. The financial records from the lockbox and the safe deposit box were complete. Carol had been meticulous in a way that Agent Taft said twice was extraordinary, the kind of documentation that would have taken a trained investigator months to assemble. She had traced the money through 12 shell companies across 4 states. She had photographed the ledgers. She had obtained, through means Agent Taft said she would prefer not to know in detail, bank statements from 3 offshore accounts. But the most devastating piece of evidence was something I hadn't expected. Inside the lockbox, beneath the financial documents, was a small, digital recorder. Carol had labeled it in her handwriting. Patricia, October 14th. Agent Taft played it. My wife's voice, calm and clear. Patricia, I know what the firm has been used for. I know about the network, I know about the accounts in Belize and the LLC in Delaware. I've documented all of it. I'm telling you this because you are my friend, and because I believe you may still have a chance to do the right thing. Then Patricia's voice. A voice I had heard at my dinner table dozens of times, warm and familiar. Carol, sweetheart, you've always been so thorough. A pause. That's the problem. I sat in that FBI conference room and listened to my wife's murderer speak. I did not say anything. I did not move. Agent Taft stopped the recording. She looked at me carefully. I told her to keep playing it. There were 12 more minutes. By the end of those 12 minutes, Patricia had made it clear that my wife would be given one opportunity to step away and forget what she knew, and that the alternative was something she phrased in the same way my wife had written it in her letter as an accident. An unfortunate accident. It would be such a shame. My wife had recorded the entire conversation. Agent Taft assembled her task force within 10 days. They moved carefully because they had to the network Patricia was connected to, had, as my wife suspected, law enforcement contacts in 2 counties. They brought in agents from 3 field offices. They coordinated with federal prosecutors in Boston and New York. On the morning of March 4th, they arrested Patricia at her home in Greenwich, Connecticut, where she had been living for 2 years in a house that cost $4 million. They also arrested 7 other members of the network, a county sheriff in upstate New York, 2 men who ran a logistics company outside of Hartford, a woman who operated what appeared to be a legitimate cleaning service in Providence, and the man who had followed my wife home from the grocery store that afternoon, a man who investigators confirmed had been in Vermont on the weekend my wife died. His name was Vincent Morales. He had been to the lake property before. He knew the dock. He knew my wife's habits. The medical examiner reopened the case. New forensic analysis of photographs taken at the scene, photographs that had been taken as a matter of routine and filed away, showed bruising on my wife's left wrist, inconsistent with a fall, consistent with someone having grabbed her. It was ruled a homicide. I did not watch the arrest on the news. I was sitting on my back porch with my son and my daughter when it happened, holding my youngest grandchild in my lap, a little girl named Clara who was 2 years old and smelled like talcum powder and had her grandmother's eyes. My son had his arm around my shoulder, and my daughter was crying quietly, and we all sat there together in the morning light while I told them the truth about what had happened to their mother. My son is 58 years old, a high school principal in New Hampshire, the kind of man who never breaks in front of his children if he can help it. He broke that morning. I let him. I held on to him the way I had held him when he was small, and I thought about how his mother would have wanted to be there for this too, for the grief and for the relief of it, for the moment when not knowing finally became knowing. My daughter is 55. She lives 20 minutes from me, has 3 children of her own. She is quieter than her brother, more internal, the one who processes things slowly and completely before she speaks. She said very little that morning. She just sat with her coffee going cold and looked at the yard her mother had planted and tended for decades, the rose bushes along the fence, the vegetable garden my wife had kept going every summer until she couldn't. After a long time, my daughter said, "She knew the whole time. She knew, and she still kept making Sunday dinners and asking about the grandkids and acting like everything was fine." I said yes. She said, "That must have been so lonely. I have thought about that every day since." The trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended every day. I sat in the front row and I watched Patricia walk in each morning in her careful clothes with her careful expression, and I thought about my wife alone in her workshop, alone in her knowledge, protecting us with her silence. The prosecution played the recording. Carol's voice, steady and unhurried, laying out the evidence for her friend the way she might have explained a tax discrepancy to a client. Precise, unemotional, completely devastating. The courtroom went very quiet. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When the foreperson read the verdict, Patricia did not look at me. She looked straight ahead. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, human trafficking, obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced her to 42 years. At her age, that is the rest of her life. When the verdict was read, I took out my wife's letter from my jacket pocket. I have carried it with me every day since I found it. I held it in my hands and I looked at the back of Patricia's head as she was led out of the courtroom, and I thought about what my wife would have felt at that moment. I don't think she would have felt triumphant. Carol was never triumphant. I think she would have felt relieved. I think she would have let out a long, slow breath and said, "Well, that's done," and meant it. The aftermath has been long and complicated in the way that justice always is. 19 women were recovered through the investigation. women who had been moved through Patricia's network and whose lives had been controlled and exploited for years. Some of them are still in the process of rebuilding. There is an organization in Albany that works with survivors of trafficking, and I made a substantial donation to it in my wife's name. It felt like the right thing. She would have done the same. The county sheriff who was arrested lost his badge and his pension and served 14 months before being transferred to a minimum security facility. His constituents were furious in ways that local news covered for months. There were town halls. There were calls for investigations into how he had been elected and re-elected while covering for a trafficking network. Agent Taft told me at the end of the trial that my wife's documentation was the most carefully prepared evidence file she had ever received from a civilian. She said it had been used as a case study in a training seminar. She said she had been watching it sit in her evidence archive for 3 years, hoping the chain of custody would come together. She said my wife had known exactly what she was doing. I already knew that. Hal Brennan came back 3 months ago. I called him for another job, a leaking gutter on the north side of the house. He came out on a Saturday morning, and we drank coffee in the kitchen while he looked at the work order, and I watched him trying to figure out whether to say anything about what he had found in the workshop. Finally, he said, "I saw the news. About the arrest. About your wife." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm glad they got her." I said, "I am too." He fixed the gutter and I paid him, and we shook hands in the driveway, and that was the end of it. Good man, Hal. Knows when to speak and when not to. I am 63 years old now. I live alone in the house where my wife and I raised our children and buried 3 dogs and argued about wallpaper and danced badly in the kitchen on New Year's Eve. I have not changed much about the house. I am not ready for that. But I have started going into her workshop again. I go down there in the evening sometimes, and I sit at her pottery wheel, and I don't throw anything. I just sit. I look at her glazing brushes, still arranged by size. I look at her apron on its hook. The hidden panel is still there behind the shelving unit. I left it. I don't know why exactly. Something about sealing it back up felt wrong. It felt like erasing something that should stay visible. A record of what she did in there. My grandchildren ask me about their grandmother more than they used to. After the trial, after the news coverage, she became someone larger in their minds, which I understand, but which also makes me a little sad sometimes. Because to me, she was never larger than life. She was exactly life-sized. She was a woman who made the beds with hospital corners and could never remember to charge her phone and made the best chicken soup I have ever tasted, and cried at commercials, and had a drawer full of birthday cards she had bought and forgotten to send. She was also a woman who spent 8 months alone with an enormous secret and built a case that dismantled a trafficking network and left behind enough evidence to convict her own murderer. Both of those things were equally true and equally her. My daughter's oldest, a 17-year-old named Emma, who has her grandmother's way of listening, asked me a few months ago if my wife had been scared. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I said I think she was probably scared every day. I think the fear was part of the reason she didn't tell anyone. Not just the practical reasons about safety, but because naming the fear out loud would have made it harder to keep going. And she had decided she was going to keep going. Emma thought about that. Then she said, "So she just kept it inside and kept working." I said yes. Emma said, "That sounds exactly like her." It does. It sounds exactly like her. There are still questions I will never have answers to. I have learned to hold them without needing to resolve them, whether she ever considered telling me, whether there were moments when she almost did, when she sat across from me at the dinner table with this enormous thing pressing on her and came close to just saying it. I believe there were. I believe she chose silence every time because she believed it was the right choice. I can't be angry at her for that choice. She was trying to protect the people she loved the only way she knew how, which was to put herself between us and the danger and hope it would be enough. It wasn't enough to save her, but it was enough to do what she set out to do. I have started going to her grave on Sunday mornings, something I did not do in the first years after she died because I could not bear it. Now, I go most weeks. I bring coffee for myself, and I sit on the bench the cemetery keeps near her section, and I talk to her. I tell her about the grandchildren, about Clara's first sentences, about Emma's college applications, about my son's school and my daughter's garden and the cardinals at the feeder that never stop fighting. I tell her that Patricia is in prison, that the network is dismantled, that the women who were trafficked through it are being helped, that her evidence file is in an FBI archive where agents in training read it and learn from it. I tell her the truth, which is that I miss her every single day, and that I don't know if that will ever fully change. I am 63 years old, and I am not sure I am built for starting over. But I have stopped sitting in the kitchen watching the cardinals and not seeing them. I have started seeing them again. She asked me in her letter to live, to be present for our children and grandchildren, to not let grief make a ghost of me. I am working on it. Some days I am better at it than others. My daughter says I seem lighter this year. My son says he sees more of the man his mother married. I think they are being kind, but I also think they are a little right. Last month I went down to the workshop and I sat at the pottery wheel and I put my hands in the clay for the first time. I had no idea what I was doing. I made a lopsided, collapsing mess that had nothing to recommend it. I laughed at it, which surprised me. I laughed alone in my wife's workshop at my terrible pottery, and then I sat there for a while in the quiet. She would have thought that was hilarious. She would have stood in the doorway with her coffee and her apron and her beautiful, uncomplicated laugh, and she would have said, "Raymond Calloway, I've been trying to get you down here for 12 years, and I would have said better late than never, and she would have agreed. I am going to keep trying. That is what she asked of me, and it is the least I can do. There is a crack in the drywall now where the hidden panel meets the original wall. You would never notice it unless you were looking. But sometimes when I am in the workshop in the evening and the light comes in at a certain angle, I can see it clearly. A thin line, barely visible, running from floor to ceiling. A seam in the wall where a woman hid everything she knew because she loved us too much to do anything else. I put my hand on the wall sometimes and I close my eyes. And I just stand there for a while, holding on. Thank you for listening to this. If you have someone in your life who seems to be carrying something alone, please reach out to them today, not tomorrow. Today. The people we love sometimes decide to protect us by going silent, and sometimes by the time we realize it, the chance to share the weight is already gone. Don't let that happen if you can help it. And if you are the one carrying something alone right now, I want you to hear this from a 63-year-old man who has had a long time to think about it. The people who love you would rather know. However frightening it seems, however much you want to protect them, they would rather stand beside you than find out later that you stood in the dark alone. Let them in. The coffee is on. The cardinals are at the feeder. The morning has already started. Go be in it.